We're here at the Heartland Developer Conference in the fall of 2014. I'm here with Pete Brown. He works for Microsoft and the keynote speaker this morning. Pete, thanks for taking a few minutes to be with us.
Thanks for having me.
Good to have you. Tell us a little bit about your role at Microsoft, what you do, or what they pay you to do, and then maybe what you do that they don't pay you to do.
Right. So luckily, what I get paid to do is what I love to do.
Oh,
so
good.
They tend to work out really well. I focus on a few different areas at Microsoft. I work a lot with XAML and .NET teams. I've had a lot of experience with them over the years and supporting WPF in the community and just XAML and everything. Then I work with creative apps and technologies for musicians. Again, another area that I love to work with. So working with the creative audio teams and being able to work with actual musicians out there, some of which have been fairly famous, so it's been pretty exciting.
Yeah, very cool.
With them. And then the third thing, which was the subject of what I talked about today, is IoT. So I work closely with the Internet of Things team, primarily the client side. We have other folks that I work with that do a lot more on the server side and the services side and stuff as well. So really fun stuff.
Very cool. Let's kind of take those in order because I've got questions for you on all three of those areas. One, let's talk a little bit about .NET and with Microsoft. A couple years ago, as an IT professional, I kind of thought .NET would be slowly going away, and in the last 3 or 4 years, it has really made a resurgence in the developers community. What's going on at Microsoft around that framework? What are you guys excited about for the future? If I'm a .NET developer, what do I have to look forward to?
I think some of the most exciting things in .NET are the additional devices that you're going to be able to target with that. So right now we have the ability to use .NET on phones and on desktop. In the future, we're going to have .NET and some of the universal app stuff, so also JavaScript and C++ for people who like that on some of the IoT devices as well. So I think for me that's the most exciting thing. There's a lot of stuff that's going on in the .NET world that's just a refinement of what we've had before and trimming things down and making sure that it performs better and everything. But for me, the real big thing coming up is more places where I can target that code.
And the importance of Visual Studio then going forward.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I cracked a joke about it this morning where as somebody who works in IoT type stuff and who's done a lot with microcontrollers of all different sorts, I've had to use Eclipse and stuff in the past, and some people live and die by Eclipse. It's not my favorite IDE. So for me, anything I can do inside Visual Studio is a huge boon for me.
Yeah.
And I showed today demoing, deploying to the Intel Galileo a small Arduino type board from Visual Studio. So again, very, very important part of what we're doing.
Yeah. So as we see future versions of Visual Studio, what's kind of Microsoft's focus on the future with? Is it Visual Studio everywhere? Is that kind of the, you can develop on anything in any place using Visual Studio?
Well, I'm not going to speculate there.
Sure.
Not my primary focus. But as a happy user of that, I would certainly love to see Visual Studio in more places. I think some of the stuff that we've done on the Azure side for making it so that you can do more things from any device to work with Azure will certainly help there. And then a lot of the TFS stuff that we've done, making that accessible on the web, I think is a big deal. The big question is, will we make it so the compilers and the IDE work on non-Windows devices? Hard to tell. Satya is very into supporting lots of different platforms and lots of devices, so I certainly wouldn't rule it off the table.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see the change there at Microsoft, and now it's Windows or it's Office everywhere. We want it on everything and on every platform. And that's been great. From an enthusiast's perspective, from an MVP perspective, it's been great for us to see that, see those changes.
The change has been a really big deal. I mean, it's really nice to have the pressure of requiring everything to be Windows first kind of pulled back a little bit. I mean, Windows is still very, very important to us, but we can support Android and we can support iOS, and we don't have to be just about Windows, right? I mean, the cloud services and clearly a lot of the IoT stuff is not really Windows centric, but we want to make sure you have the best experience for Visual Studio and for developing on Windows, but we want to make sure we support as many places as possible.
Let's talk a little bit about that, especially with Internet of Things. There's some interesting things going on at Microsoft as far as embedding what used to be Windows embedded, and now we got Windows getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Talk a little bit about maybe your focus or what you're seeing when we talk about these smaller devices. What's Microsoft doing in that space with the OS?
Sure. We have a pretty broad array of things that have been traditional embedded that we're now kind of rebranded as Internet of Things. You have Windows Embedded Industry, which is really at the top end. It's essentially Windows 8.1 that you can use on an embedded device. And there's some interesting things going on there, where we just announced support for the Minnow Board Max, which is a board about, for people listening, it's about the size of a deck of cards. For the rest of you, it's like that, right? Oh yes, there we go.
There we go.
I'm looking at, it's not really showing it to the computer. It's not going to help.
No, it's good.
So it's a small board, but it's got an Intel Atom processor on it, 64-bit. It's essentially a tablet this size, right?
Yeah.
That can run Windows embedded, and it can be very hacker friendly, as well as very, for people who are building drivers. Then if you go all the way down, we have Windows CE and a bunch of other stuff in the middle. And then we have the Windows on Devices program, which is brand new. It's something that we announced in April, and we just started deploying. And that's right now just the Intel Galileo, which is that Quark processor that I talked about. Essentially a Pentium class from way back when Pentium was first introduced. But they've shrunk the die way down. They've lowered the power requirements. They've done all the things they need to do to make it a pretty decent contender in the IoT space. It's an enthusiast board right now, and we're far from done in what we can do on that. But we've managed to shrink Windows down, so it'll run on there with something like a 40 meg footprint, just on real basic. Like, we haven't even optimized it at this point. But being able to run Windows on that and write Win32 code, as well as use our open source implementation of the wiring libraries. So we've got those out on GitHub so that you can write Arduino type code and use a lot of Arduino code as is and run it directly on that device. So we've done a lot there. But as I sort of mentioned originally, our ultimate goal with those, and it's to be determined if this happens on the Galileo itself, there are some technical challenges there. But our ultimate goal with Windows on Devices is to be able to let you run universal apps, so that if you're a .NET developer or a JavaScript developer or a C++ developer, that same type of code that you can write to run on a phone or run on a desktop will run on these tiny devices as well. And I think that's where our real value with Visual Studio and with the skill set and everything all comes into play. Same thing all the way down.
You mentioned Universal Apps a couple times. For anybody who doesn't know what that is for Microsoft, talk a little bit about Universal Apps.
When we introduced Windows 8, we introduced the idea of Windows Store Apps, WinRT. But we had a real disconnect between big Windows and Windows Phone at the time. And you had to write separate apps for both different languages and stuff, and we started to converge those things together. And we've been doing the same thing with Xbox, where the Xbox One is running essentially a version of Windows 8 on it. In the next version of Windows, we're pulling all these things together to make sure that you can run them. They're all running the same operating system, and the same apps run across all of those. At Build in April, we announced the idea of a universal app. And a universal app is something that you write in Visual Studio that'll run across all of these different devices. So it's, again, HTML and JavaScript, C++, which can be with either DirectX or XAML, and then .NET, which C# or Visual Basic, and also using all WinRT. Those that technology, what we used to call Windows Store Apps, because we've made it so that they will run across anything, we now call universal apps. And you'll still optimize the user interface for different platforms and whatnot.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. That's the Universal Apps platform that's coming.
Yeah.
It's here, right?
Yeah. We still have. We're at 90-some-odd% API convergence right now. If you want to do a universal app that runs across Windows and Windows Phone, Xbox isn't part of it just yet. It will get there. And then same thing with our Windows for Devices is not there, but it will get there.
It's coming though. I mean, we're starting to see, especially on the Windows Phone side, we're seeing a lot of changes go on there.
Yeah.
It's been fun to watch even Windows change, Windows 8, Windows 8.1, and now with the new update, kind of really go through a metamorphosis very, very quickly. Excited to see some of the quick iterations that are coming out of Microsoft.
And the next version will be even better. We showed some preview screenshots of that at Build, where we realized how to put this delicately. We maybe missed the goal on the desktop, right? Where
it was an idea.
We kind of over-optimized for tablets.
Nevertheless,
I mean, tablets are really the future for a lot of people in touchscreen laptops. But nevertheless, we have a lot of desktop users. I'm one of them. When I'm at home, I'm on the desktop all the time. And we made it more difficult than necessary to do that, and so we're going to fix that.
We're getting some feedback from the community. We've heard that too, and as people said, "Oh, I don't know about Windows 8," I'm like, "No, try it with the new updates on it. It's a lot like your old Windows 7 box, but better." And a lot of people have said, "Oh yeah, hey, actually, this is really workable."
So the 8.1 update 1 is a huge improvement, but the big thing that we're still missing is a start menu that people will be familiar with. So the intent in the next version of Windows is, let's make it really comfortable so that people who are moving from Windows 7 find really compelling reasons to move here and are really comfortable.
Sure.
And then, of course, Windows 8 and Windows 8.1 users as well.
And are you referring to Threshold then, that version?
I'm not going to confirm any code names, but yeah. All right. So,
all right. Yeah. You don't have to. Let's move on to some Internet of Things conversation. You had some gadgets up there. What are you excited about in this space? I mean, there's a ton when Raspberry Pi was kind of, well, Arduino was really the first one out the door. Raspberry Pi came along, got popular. I'm starting to see these companies come up with these little gadgets that you can do stuff with. What are you excited about?
So I really like the Raspberry Pi.
Okay.
So I think that's a really cool device. I'm not really a Linux user. I mean, I can find my way around. I used to run Linux firewalls. I ran some of the original versions of Linux back when I was part of Boston Computer Society.
Sure.
And went to their show and stuff way back in the day. But it's not really my thing. It's the different tool chain, all sorts of stuff, right? So I do tend to be more excited about what we're doing on the Windows side of things, just because that's where I'm really comfortable. So if I had to look at two different places that, let me say three different places that really have me excited there.
Yeah.
Starting at the low end, one, I love that we're reinvesting in the .NET micro framework, because all the stuff that's happened with Netduino and stuff GHI has done and everything, there was a lot of concern from the community that we're just sort of throwing that aside. We moved that team over into the IoT team, so they're now officially part of the embedded group. They're no longer this sort of weird little part off of .NET, off the .NET group. So having them there and knowing that we're investing in them and that we'll have announcements to make soon on that, that's really exciting to me, because I love working with Chris Walker and the Netduino guys. He does some really cool stuff there. The second thing is I really like what we're doing on Windows on devices. So it's the idea that we can show people that you can get Windows down really tight, because Windows does not have your reputation for being a lean and mean operating system.
Not always, no.
So
not
it's never, bloated is a term that you hear in the community a lot and stuff. But being able to show that, hey, there's a lot of optional stuff in Windows, but if you really kind of tighten it down, we can get it to run on these relatively small devices. Not as low power as a Raspberry Pi or something yet. Could get there,
sure,
but certainly something that's really low power that you can run on it. So that's exciting to me, because then I can still use Visual Studio. All my command line stuff that I'm used to doing all works the same way. You'll be able to do .NET. Matter of fact, I was able to get a simple .NET program running on there, even though it's not officially supported yet, because when we moved the stuff over, we left the CLR on there, just not any of the base class libraries. Right? The third thing is, I work very closely with a different hardware team inside Microsoft called Sigma, Silicon Graphics and Media, which related to this. And they've been releasing development boards. And the first one that we released was the Intel Sharks Cove, which was a board about this big, paperback book roughly size, right?
Sure.
For people who still read paperback books as opposed
half a sheet
to
of
small
paper,
Kindle
maybe.
size, something like that, right? So they have released that board as a board for driver developers and companies that are looking to create hardware for Windows. Because in the past, they had to go through a really kind of special process to get their own development board, which could cost $1,500 or something like that. They had to buy Visual Studio, the full MSDN subscription or Pro, which was expensive. They had to sign an NDA and whatnot. So I've been working with those guys, and throughout the past year and a half, to help target this community, we've made sure that, one, the boards are relatively inexpensive. You can get them from places like Mouser, so you don't have to go through any special channels. None of that request a quote crap, which
you can't find them, and so you got to find them on eBay, and the prices are jacked up for those kinds of things.
And then we made it so you can use a free edition of Visual Studio with that. So we've lowered all those barriers. As a result of that, it's not just good for the hardware guys, that the companies that are doing this, but that instantly starts making these things accessible to makers and hackers. Where the Sharks Cove is a $300 board. It's not cheap by any stretch in that community. But the Middleboard Max, which we just announced support for, is $100. And that's essentially a tablet, 64-bit Atom processor on it. So if you're the kind of person that would have put a tablet on a robot, which they do in university quite a bit, being able to take this small credit card sized device, put it on there, and be able to run full Windows embedded on it is pretty huge. So those are, outside the music stuff, those are in the embedded space what really excites me.
And there's some amazing, this is a great time to be alive. There's just some amazing things coming out that are really working, that really work in our favor, especially in the tablet space and productivity space. How important then is C++ in all? for a while it seemed like even on the enterprise space that was going away. It seems to be making, or at least coming back. Is that going to get more important?
So it's like most languages ebb and flow a bit. C++ has always been really important in any kind of high performance apps. So most of the music apps that I work with, all C++.
Okay.
Like, you know, some actually are Delphi, believe it or not, but other ones are all C++. If you're going to write something like Cubase, you're going to write it in native code.
Sure.
Games, generally all C++, the serious games, right?
Yeah.
So they've always been important there, and they'll continue to be important there. But microcontrollers and embedded devices, because of the nature of the size of the code that you can put on there and everything, they've always been either assembly, C, or C++ for the vast majority of them. And so there's a lot of focus on C++ on those devices as well. And so I think you'll see a big resurgence on that side. You know, if we're talking 200 billion devices in the next 5 years or something like that,
right?
That's a lot of C++ code.
Yeah.
We're trying to make it so that's not your only choice.
Right.
But if you want to run .NET or WinRT or something, you're not going to do that on the very smallest 8-bit hardware. You need a little bit more processing.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. No, it's another hearing a lot of that in the industry kind of come back, and where that wasn't going very far, it seemed before. Let's wrap this up a little bit with your music side, because this is interesting. I know you're a Surface guy. I saw the Surface, and then when you're coming out, we had seen some. I'd seen some music apps or some things coming up with the Surface, maybe last year. Yep. We making any progress on some of those things, or what are you excited about in that arena?
So we are. Probably a lot of what you saw was something I was involved in, which is good. You know, I worked a lot with ImageLine to bring things like FL Studio Groove, and worked with Jordan Rudess to bring over MorphWiz and some things like that. But then we kind of lost steam a little bit, and the reason is we have, quite honestly, some latency issues on the audio stack on our platform. So one thing that I'm really excited with is I've been working with what we have now is called the creative audio team. We also have the creative video team that does similar stuff. I've been able to work with them, bringing in lots of different partners, and over the past year we have had calls with probably all the I don't want to say all, because somebody's going to be listening saying they didn't call me.
You'll be fine.
Many of the major hardware and software companies involved in the music business, and they've just been excited that we're even talking to them at this point. They're like, "Wow, you guys ignored us forever. Thank you for talking to us." And we said, "Hey, what's your latency requirement? What do you really need in the platform?" And you know, we're trying to do our best in the next version of Windows to address as many of those as possible. One of the first things that we did at Build is Jason and I introduced the new WinRT MIDI API, which is a MIDI API for connecting musical instruments and synthesizers and stuff to something like a Surface. So we made sure that was our first thing. It was a Windows API released via NuGet, so that was a real experience for the Windows team. They'd never done that before. And so we worked through that and able to get that out. And then we're just doing more leading up to the next version of Windows. And at the same time, I've been talking to companies about building apps. You know, what can we build for the next version? And it's my hope that we'll have some really cool stuff come lunchtime. For the next version.
Well, I think a Surface makes a great podcasting device in a lot of ways. We've let's talk real quick about Surface.
Let me add one more thing.
Yeah.
So I have a Surface Pro 3, which I got, which is really, if you're somebody who's doing musician type stuff, it's really the thing that we offer that's probably the best thing for you, because most serious music apps are desktop apps, and then as we do more on the touch side and the tablet side, it has both, right? And I'm going to be speaking as a Microsoft representative at an event in Boston at the end of this month called A3 Exchange, and they have several panels which are music app developer focused, and you know, we'll be there. So I think just the fact that Microsoft is having representation at some of these events, and that they're interested in hearing about Surface and interested in hearing about what we're doing, is in itself an improvement over what we had before.
Yeah, no, it's exciting, and I love what's going on with Surface. There's been a couple versions that's come out. We've seen the Core i3 now, Core i5, Core i7. Have you experienced any of those platforms across? I mean, have you used all three of them for what you're doing? Is there any better? Seems like that Core i5 is the sweet spot on the Surface. What's been your experience?
I have an i7, i7 256 with 8 gigs of memory, which quite honestly has turned out to be a bit of overkill. I really think the i5 256 gig for people who are doing creative work, like I do Photoshop and stuff on there, as well as all the music apps. The i5 I think is really the sweet spot there. It's quite a bit less. I think it's a few $100s less. i5 is going to run cooler than an i7, so your fan's going to turn on less often.
They run pretty hot. We know that for sure.
When you crank the CPU, I mean, That's an i5 or an i7 in. That's not an Atom processor.
No,
or excuse me,
it's
not
not.
an ARM processor in there.
It gets pretty warm, those boxes. And it's such tight. I mean, the milling on that is so tight.
Yeah.
You're almost touching the CPU.
Right. I mean, and they have the magnesium case, and that is itself the heatsink. So, you know, think about it. Like, I have an overclocked desktop, and I can tell you that runs hot, right?
Yeah.
But this one, the fact that they were able to get that level of Intel processor inside something that thin, and have it run without like melting is actually impressive to me.
Yeah.
Now, I did see some early reports of some temperature issues online and stuff. I know there've been a bunch of firmware updates that have helped fix that. I've never had it shut down due to temperature. I've had it get pretty toasty when I was doing some serious work. But so far it's handled it pretty well.
Yeah, no, very good. And I think I'd lean towards the Core i3 version of that, but it's just one of those things that I had a Surface 2, I had the RT version of Surface.
I have that as well.
And my daughter loved it so much, she begged me for it, and I gave it to her, and she's just loving it. She, you know.
The i3 is a good processor, right? So if you're not doing the type of work that we're talking about doing, or, you know, encoding video and stuff, the i3 is a really good step up from something like an Atom, where you've got a real x86 processor that can do pretty much anything else that you would want to throw in it.
Well, we finally, that sounds critical, but we finally got the pen working right. And on Surface 3, that pen is just dynamite. And it's just, it writes like butter. I mean, it's just incredible how good that is. So
OneNote is the killer app there. So I use it all the time now.
It's pretty good, yeah. And we go back and forth. We use, you know, we started before OneNote really went live, so to speak. We used a lot of Google Docs for that. But I've been going back and forth. A lot of my work stuff is kept in OneNote, and I'm able to share that. And it's been a great, whatever emphasis they put on it at Microsoft, they've done some amazing work from the OneNote
I use
team.
it for, so I'll enter notes on my desktop, and then it's available on my phone. So I'd use it for even silly little things like shopping lists and remind me to get
to-do lists are great for that. And it syncs, and for some of the work podcast stuff that we do, I keep all our podcast notes in there, and so I can get to them from anywhere. We're going to podcast live, so I'll podcast live for Gallup Friday from here, and I don't have to worry about that, right? Just bring it up, and it'll work just fine. Pete, any last thoughts? Anything you said in there that you want to tell somebody as far as what's coming up at Microsoft?
So just a little thing in general. So one of the themes and one of the that I tried to get across today was the idea of bringing your kids into this technology more. So, you know, making sure that you encourage them to be makers, and that, you know, it's not just about kind of boring coding, but you need to find what I said there, Commodore 64. So I'm 40 some odd years old. For me, it was a Commodore 64 that got me into it at the time. For kids today, it's these little devices where they can just go and blink LEDs and build robots and stuff, you know, or it's something like Little Bits, or it's something like Raspberry Pi or whatever. Find their thing that's really interesting to them, so that you can encourage them to be in this industry and do really cool stuff, as opposed to just, you know, the grind of, because we know there's always a grind aspect of the coding. So encouraging them to get past that and do all the really fun stuff.
So Jody and I run a high school internship program for Gallup, and we are trying to get high schoolers excited about software development. I've thought in this maker movement that we're having, as well as things have gotten smaller, but what advice would you give me as I'm running I got high schoolers. We want to teach them software development, but from what you've seen, if I were to bring one program in to have them monkey with something, what would you recommend?
Oh boy, what program would I recommend? So for a high school level, from a selfish aspect, I would love to see some of the Windows on Devices stuff go on there. It's not quite ready yet for that. So it's sort of like
I should keep my eye on it.
So I do think that's keeping your eye on it, and at the same time, letting them know that at Microsoft we're actually doing stuff here. Like, I had the same issue with musicians I spoke with, where they thought, oh, we didn't know you could make music on Windows. We're really bad about getting the message of creativity on Windows out. So, I mean, being able to do some really cool things there would be really good. The Little Bit stuff targets a younger group, I think, less so than high school, although there's some high school thing there.
Although I know some adults who like it.
Yeah, it's certainly one of them. So I think there's some play there. But really, I would focus on, right now, Arduino, Raspberry Pi, and those types of things, because that is where they're going to get the most bang for the buck. But again, I would encourage them to look at the full spectrum of what's out there, not just from us, but also just from other companies, where so they can realize what all those devices are, what they can use to target them, what the different coding environments are, and because this is high school, expose them to as diverse a group of technology as possible, because they're still making up their mind as to what they like. Where if you focus on only one thing, you've probably kind of hamstrung them a bit, so that when they get into college, like, well, I only know Android, I only know iOS, or whatever things that they're going to be coding in. They're at that age where they can learn pretty much anything.
Yeah, we made it through this whole interview. We never even talked about Azure. So there's lots of exciting things coming out on that platform as well, right?
Yeah, I mentioned the IoT group. I work mostly with the client side, but there's a whole group of people that work on services, that are building services for connecting all these devices, and it's all built on Azure and very closely with the Azure team. And as you can imagine, especially with Satya as CEO right now, Azure is more important than ever. And it's become our kind of our big thing inside the company. So here's an example of where these fit in. There's a company in the UK that builds synthesizers, really nice ones, like they cost about $5,200 US, right? They have embedded in that a small computer. I'm not going to say what it runs or anything like that.
Sure.
But they have a small computer embedded inside that, and it has a web server built in, and you can remotely manage it and whatnot. But they also have a cloud service. This is a cloud-connected synthesizer. They have a cloud service that they can use to transfer patches, to collaborate, do all sorts of cool things. So the whole idea of cloud-connected devices, and technically that's kind of an IoT thing, right?
Yeah, very much so.
The idea of these cloud-connected devices is it's much more than just running your typical data center server up in the cloud. There's a lot more going on in Azure.
No, and Azure's been amazing. I've been on Azure for a couple years now.
They're not running Azure, by the way, but they're same idea.
It's been great though. I run my blog off Azure. WordPress works great with it. There's some mobile services that are available for you. There's a lot of attractive reasons why to be on Azure at this point. So we're going to get them involved. The kids are going to get an opportunity to set up their own Azure service and have their blog kind of through Azure.
Getting just cloud connected and building those robots and having the robot report data back up to the cloud is a really big deal and an extremely useful skill.
Cool. Well, Pete, thanks for taking a few minutes to be with us. Thanks for coming to Omaha. Always good to see you when you're here. And I want to thank you for watching this, and we'll have some more information about what's going on in the show notes for this broadcast. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
We're here at the Heartland Developers Conference, Omaha 2014. I'm here with Dustin Tower, and we've had a good morning so far. Dustin, welcome. Good to see you again.
It's good to see you. It's been a couple months here.
I know. It hasn't been long.
Infotech, I think.
I think it was. And did we interview you last? Were you here last year? Did we interview you?
Not at the Heartland Developer Conference, no. This is my first time here, actually.
Okay. So, well, welcome back. Good to see you. Talk a little bit about what you're talking about here at the conference. That's kind of the goal of these, is just to give kind of a summary overview. You don't have to give it all, but talk a little bit about why you're here and what you're talking about.
Well, yesterday I actually did a workshop on responsive web design, so that was a little bit more front-end, HTML, CSS driven, and today is the more technical session on, its title is Front-End Developer Workflows, but I'm focusing on Node.js, which is a good platform for kind of creating your automation processes and making that front-end development process a little bit more streamlined for developers that are used to a very streamlined process on the back end.
Yeah, so, we talk about responsive. Give me a summary of where we're at today when we talk with PC numbers diminishing, and we still sell 1 million PCs a day, but they are diminishing. We've moved to some tablets, although that's slowing down too. Huge market in the phone. Responsive was kind of going to be every be-all, end-all. It was going to work. Is that working?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, when you look at the stats, desktop market penetration as far as the number of people who are acquiring desktop computers actually hasn't changed since 2007. Okay. So all those sales are people just getting updating their computer, right?
The enterprise is full of PCs.
Absolutely. So we're not seeing any growth anymore with PC on the PC side. Mobile side, of course, is a different story, and Q3, Q4 of this year is where the transition is happening between web traffic being or mobile traffic on the web overtaking the desktop traffic. So we're actually going to, right now, starting to see more traffic on the web that's mobile than desktop. It's the first time in the history that it's been like that. So there's obviously a huge need for our web presences to be mobile oriented and responsive. And you know, the techniques that people use nowadays, it goes from either being a one solution site where they have a single site, it's going to work across all the platforms, or they try to do a hybrid solution where they've got a website, but they also have a mobile app or a mobile version of the site, and that's harder to maintain, and that's why responsive web design is really, you know, grown as it has, because people want a one-product solution.
But there's some problems with that still, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, where are we still struggling in responsive design as far as what's still not working that forces me into a native app?
Yeah, I think, you know, what it is capabilities in some cases. When people want to take advantage of, you know, high-end animation, they're trying to make games online, and you can do that now in a responsive fashion, but it's really difficult for that kind of interactivity.
And why is that?
It's just partially because, you know, you got to factor in all these different screen resolutions, you got to factor in where things are going. So responsive, while it can be done in an interactive and gaming side, it can be really difficult to maintain. The other things that really give people trouble is the way that they consume their services. If they're a service-oriented company, you know, for example, like you know, Google Maps, you know, they've got a responsive website that you can actually go, but they have an app because the app just is more powerful. It's not built in JavaScript. It's built, you know, in a native language for whatever platform they're targeting. And so, you know, there's things that you can leverage that are more powerful on the devices still that the browser rendering maybe can't keep up with. But that really is changing now, and it's becoming less of an excuse to not do responsive. You know, you really should be focusing on finding that solution where, you know, if I'm on a website on my phone, I'm the consumer, I want to look at what I want to look at. I don't want you as a developer to decide, oh, you're on a phone, I'm just going to show you a couple of things from our site because we're not going to show you everything. And that's really what we want to change, because nowadays I view a lot of sites on my phone that I never did before because it's just handier, it's easier to get at.
Yeah, and as the end user, I don't really care if it's, you know, I just want to get to it, right?
Well, and there's another stat that just came out a couple months ago that 65% of mobile users download 0 apps per month. So literally no apps per month.
Yeah.
And you know, when I saw that, I kind of questioned it, but then I thought to myself, when I get a new phone, I download the Twitter app, I get all my productivity apps on there, and then I'm done.
Yeah.
I really don't download many apps because when I go to a news website and it prompts me to download their app, I cancel out of that and I try to find the content in the browser because that's where I want to be.
Yeah.
I don't want to be constantly jumping back and forth between apps and sites and apps and sites.
Right.
You know, especially when you're in an app, some kind of reader app, and it opens up the URLs in the browser, and then you got to like toggle back and forth between.
Well, and then Android asks you, hey, do you want to open this? And
you know, it's just not that seamless of a workflow, and we want that seamless workflow that that we're used to on the desktop and everywhere else. And really, the way that browsers have been updated now and support the technologies, the way we're phasing out older browsers, there really isn't an excuse not to be able to leverage technology.
Yeah. So like the native browsers, I shouldn't say native, but yeah, so
the
native,
big browsers.
the big browsers, so Chrome and Safari on Android or iPhone, IE on Windows Phone at this point. The progress is coming along, is what you're saying. So now the functionality inside of them is good enough. We talked about so one of the limitations in there is just maybe even accessing the hardware. But what about it seems like rich media. You talked about gaming. What about rich media? How are we making progress? Because as a podcaster, I'm worried about video and audio.
Video at work. Yep,
right?
Absolutely.
And video has always seemed to be the Achilles heel of mobile.
Well, it is, and you know, the video is kind of one of those topics on the web. There's a lot of factors that contribute to the video quality and the way the video is going to play. I mean, you have the basic ones like bandwidth. You know, if you're on a slow connection, it doesn't matter if you're on a laptop or a phone or anywhere else, you're not going to view the video. But how you deploy the video is really the game changer in there. You know, a lot of companies that want to put videos up on their site, you know, I tell them just host them on YouTube and embed them on your page, because YouTube's got the backbone on their server to be able to support the traffic that might be viewing it. They also do dynamic streaming, where they're going to give you a lower quality version of the video if you're on a slower connection. Again, they don't care if you're a phone or a tablet or what. If you're not on a fast connection, they're going to try to give you an optimized version of the video. But outside of that, then you still have things like memory and RAM and stuff on devices that, as we're playing media, can contribute to that experience. And most of the mobile platforms have done a really good job of when a video is playing, it actually is playing not so much embedded and interpreted by the page, but actually off the hardware itself. So, on an iPhone, when you click a video, it kind of launches full screen, and it's really playing in its own little video viewer. But as soon as you close it, you're back on the web page. They're trying to bridge those gaps between performance, and then hopefully the bandwidth side kind of massages itself out.
Yeah, and actually, I think the best example of that today is Facebook. They, in their app, now it's an app, it's not responsive, but in their app, it's a real smooth, even to those preview videos are playing
the little clips that they play
you hover over and then they'll play for you. Sound turned off. What they're doing, whatever they're doing, is great. I think that's a great user experience.
Yeah, and it's those kinds of things that change the way that we consume video and establish kind of new paradigms in how we want to view it. Because I think that's the other key to responsive web design is, I kind of stressed in my topic yesterday that it's not about taking your full site right now and squishing it down onto a smaller screen, because there are things that aren't as usable on that size screen, whether it's navigation, whether it's the kind of interactivity you have on your site, if it's drag and drop. The classic example for me is a Google map being embedded on a site. Greatly usable thing on a regular website where you can go to a contact us page, see the Google map, drag it around, zoom in and zoom out. But in a responsive site, oftentimes the Google map is taking up the full width of the view of your screen. And as you're scrolling down, the second you get to the map, you actually start scrolling the map, and you can't scroll the page anymore unless you grab a part outside of the map and scroll it. And so that's an example of, even though the Google map can be responsive and look good on a mobile phone, swapping it out with a static image that people can click on to launch the map or something might be more usable. And the same thing with those video previews. On mobile, rather than have to click a video, start playing the whole thing from the beginning, having this sort of animated GIF style pre-roll that's really low bandwidth and just kind of giving you a glimpse of what the video is all about keeps you from having to wait for it to start streaming. And you can, I don't really want to watch that. You can scroll through it and move on.
Sometimes I've watched the whole thing, like with no sound, and I'm like, oh, good enough. And then you just you don't even evoke the player.
It's a clip, or it lets you decide how you want to consume that content. And that is responsive design. Even though it's an app, it's still a really great responsive technique to say, all right, at this platform, at this level, this is the way we're going to allow the user experience that they can still tap on it, play it the regular way, but we're going to give them some other alternatives here.
Yeah. Well, you brought up, you made a statement about going to YouTube, and when I first started podcasting, I had that same thought. I was like, I'm not going to create a brand new RSS. I'm not going to do this. It's just go to YouTube. And I've actually, so my listeners changed my mind. I got some feedback from a few of them. They're like, we'd like to be able to download your video. And so for whatever reason, in that environment, it's not either or. We still provide it via YouTube if you want to watch it there. But I put out RSS feeds, and immediately I'm getting, let's just say 50 or so downloads already. The feeds are brand new, and I'm getting already a bunch of hits. It just goes to, we're in a transition period, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and that's kind of the way that's the way people kind of get into handling our increasingly mobile audience, is figuring out what's the best way to deliver my content and the way that my consumers want to see it. And providing that for them, and like the RSS feed that you're doing, RSS feeds have been around forever.
I know,
right?
Since the beginning of time.
And the great thing about it is you just put a different skin on top of it. You just kind of consume the content. You just say, hey, all right, if you're on a desktop, you can plug this into whatever your reader is. If you're on mobile, great, you can still consume it. But what the user actually sees can be optimized. For platform.
And what was odd is I have users who wanted to watch the video large, so about 920. In that range, and they wanted to. I could go full 1080, but that's it's a little bit of an overkill. for what they're doing. They're downloading it to the tablet because they're in a situation where they don't have connectivity. And so YouTube does not provide still yet a great offline player. That would be awesome if they allowed, but then, you know.
And that's really that's another one of the big things about the responsive movement that is a hurdle for companies that go to, like, for example, The Verge, the tech blog, you know, kind of a spin-off of Engadget.
Yeah.
Just a couple days ago, they launched their new site. It actually looks the exact same as their previous redesign, but they rebuilt it to be completely responsive. They're getting rid of their mobile app. They're getting rid of their mobile website. They want one product for users to consume. Part of the hurdle, though, that comes with that is offline capabilities, and so those are the kind of things that companies do recognize, and sometimes the reason why they go toward a native app, because they can have something that runs without internet connection that synchronizes data back and forth. Now, with that being said, the web APIs that allow you to do the same kind of thing just in browser have offline websites that work without internet. You know, if you've ever bookmarked a website on your phone, it saves down. It looks just like a regular app. It's got an icon on your phone. When you launch that, it can actually be running in an offline mode. Those APIs vary a little bit browser to browser. That's why it's not a completely standardized solution yet. But that's what will replace apps, you know, as that technology progresses. Where, you know, when I pull up my website and I bookmark it, it will download everything I want, or every time I'm running it with internet, it can be syncing data behind the scenes.
I think that's the key, right? Is that control over the sync of having some, like, when I want, and maybe even intelligent sync, right? Which is, how often am I accessing this? And then it's going to set some kind of rhythm that tries to predict, like, so, hey, do I need to go every hour, or I only check it once a day? So
well, how much history do you want to keep? You know, all that kind of, and that's, you know, the nice thing about that is that's not a technique that is foreign, because mail apps do that all the time. You know, your note-taking apps, Dropbox, all these kind of apps have been doing this for years and years and years. And so the process of doing that isn't different. It's just applying that to the web and to websites that are going to run that way is where things have to go. And again, it's not every case. Sometimes you need to have internet to use certain sites and use certain features. So,
like the stock market,
exactly.
Like sports scores.
Exactly. The stocks from yesterday aren't going to help you out at all, right?
A cash stock price is not going to help you.
Precisely.
We talked a little bit about games. We talked some about video and let's say rich media content. What else? What are the stumbling points right now, or the roadblocks on responsive design?
The stumbling points is a perfect segue to what I'm going to do this afternoon with the workflows, and really back-end developers, you know, .NET developers, Java developers for years have had great tooling. You know, they're used to tooling, they're used to workflows that have been really well. And as we transition to front-end development, where it's not just making things look pretty on the web, there's a lot of JavaScript coding. Kind of, you know, have front-end, back-end, and there's kind of this middle end that's a merge. You know, and that's kind of a little bit what my talk about Node is about. But it's trying to find workflows that simulate what you would do on the server, where you're automating your builds, where now your files are done, you're gathering them together and publishing them to a server, but publishing them in a compressed format, in a minifying your code, making it, you know, more optimized, because the sites that we're building nowadays are being used in low bandwidth situations or on devices or in other places. And so there isn't a lot of tooling out there to do that right now. A lot of the things that we use are actually command line solutions. It's kind of funny. It looks like a little like we're programming back in the 90s with some of the ways we're building things, but they're very sophisticated processes that we're using. And that's kind of the stumbling block for people as they move to this front-end development side, is our previous models of development still work, but they need to be modified a little bit so that we can actually create this content on the front end in an efficient manner.
Yeah, we jumped through a lot of hoops for low bandwidth or no bandwidth on the mobile device. We did a similar thing in the 90s, let's say in early 2000, where we couldn't guarantee broadband, and so we did a lot of that stuff. And then, of course, now it's almost assumed if it's going to be PC.
Yep, we're angry if we don't have fast Wi-Fi.
Exactly.
Right?
Oh, no, it's yeah, I got here today, and I was coming over Wi-Fi. I'm like, that's not going to work, and they wired me in, and I had 50 up and down. I'm like, oh, that's going to be plenty.
Yeah, but
right,
and that used to be impressive, but you're like, okay, yeah, that'll be fine.
Exactly. But are we going to get to that point with mobile, do you see, in the future, where it's less of a bandwidth discussion? Because certainly we're putting up more towers.
No, I think it's, you know, it is something that, you know, they're it's not far off to
Yeah.
imagine a world where you're always connected. Right?
Does that change things for you, thinking-wise? Is like the things we do today, is 5 years from now, is some of those hoops we're jumping through now going to just be a foregone conclusion?
5 years from now, I'm not so sure, because I think right now a lot of what we're doing in the responsive realm, while it is sort of standardized, there is still a lot of disparity from team to team. You know, you talk to one developer, they do it one way. You talk to another developer, they do it the other way. And they're all kind of the similar techniques, but so I think 5 years from now is a little conservative, or a little aggressive in us having a completely different mentality. But I think it is with the way that cloud computing works and the way that we're providing content to our users. The models are changing. We're still going to have some interface that the users are connecting with, some situations that we're not going to have internet connection, but I think that sort of online-offline presence is going to become more seamless. You know, it's not really going to matter whether you're connected or not, because of the way that we're managing data and because of the way the applications work.
Sure.
We're connected so frequently that things are syncing without us knowing, and we're just always sort of up to date and living in a world where it's like that. Like I just saw on Twitter today that I think it's GM announced I forget what models or what cars. I just saw a quick headline that they going to have 4G Wi-Fi in all their cars that they're shipping. You know, so like you're driving around in a 4G connection. You know, basically. You know, I mean that's
SIM card. Put your SIM card
in.
That's the
problem driving between here and Omaha. You know, I pretty much on the interstate have LTE the whole way. I don't have really many drop calls, but that didn't used to be the case. You're in the car and you didn't know if you were going to have your GPS working or not, because it's all data driven now. It's not in the downloaded ahead of time.
Well, and aren't cars a perfect example of off and online and being able to elegantly move between those two states, and for the end user not even know, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
that's a perfect example of that.
That's the key there, is for the end user, they shouldn't know whether they're in an app, a website, wherever. It's supposed to be seamless.
Getting the information they need.
We want them to get the information they want, however
in
they
some
want
intelligent way. You were talking about the workflow and the anything else in there you want to highlight in that as far as what you're talking about?
You know, it's going to be it's like I said, it's a new way of thinking or a new way of working for back-end developers. But it's funny, it's really not any different than what they're doing. The kind of automation that we're using is the same automation they're using in Studio or or Eclipse or whatever tool that they're using. It's just a different platform to do it. So it's something that, when I first saw it, I was a little hesitant into, I don't really know if that's going to work, but now using Node and incorporating that into my workflows, it's really changed the way that I develop. And so I think it's kind of, as back-end developers move toward the front end, or any kind of developer is incorporating front-end workflows into what they do, keep an open mind about what you're using and really experiment, because the community has really grown around it. So there's a lot of help out there, and the efficiencies emerge pretty quickly through it.
What do you, for your customers, what are you telling them from a web server standpoint? They're building apps, they're building not apps, but they're building responsive sites. For you, where's the best place to go right now? What do you like as far as architecture, and there's this in-house versus moving it to the cloud? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it varies like nowadays, there's very seldom do we come across companies that need a website, right? Or that don't have, so whether they're hosted on GoDaddy or Amazon or S3 or Media Temple or anything, the web host doesn't really matter as much, aside from high bandwidth sites that need to have
redundancy,
dedicated servers and that kind of thing. So I tend to tell people, stay wherever you are if you're happy with the performance of the server, if you're happy with the traffic, if you're not having any downtime. If your server is having trouble, downline, can't handle the bandwidth or the traffic that you have, that's the time to move.
Time to move on.
And it's always easier to move when you're doing a rebuild versus moving an existing site. So when you're getting to the point where you're going to start, okay, we're going to redo our site, we're going to make a responsive website. Well, don't just think from a design standpoint. What do we want it to look like? How do we want it to work? Think also from that infrastructure. Are you happy where you currently are? Are there problems with the web host that you're currently using? Because that's the time to change.
Right.
But web hosting is there's tons of them out there. It's a dime a dozen, but it just depends on what you're using.
What about the architecture, though, on that? How is that changing, or what kind of recommendations when we talk about what they're running and the actual platforms?
The kind of cool thing about responsive design is, whether you're hosted on a Windows box doing .NET or your PHP farm, really the key to responsive web design is that it really doesn't know about your backend and what you're communicating with. So the buzzword nowadays is have APIs, right? So if you're a company that provides services to whether they're in-house or external, you don't know oftentimes where your data is going to be consumed. So you want services that spit out JSON data that you can consume, whether it's in a mobile app, whether it's in a redone responsive site with some sort of JavaScript app that you have running on there. That API, that kind of middle layer that's communicating from the front end to your architecture on the back end, is really the most important part, because that is the interchangeable part. That's the part that we want to drop in there so we can switch out our UI and make it look completely different, but we aren't affecting at all the back end, as opposed to, and this technique, it's, standard separation of your UI layer from your data layer. That's nothing new nowadays, but it's even more evident that we want to have that separation so that we can start incorporating what we're building or what we have built into different, mediums and different views, different platforms.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just interviewed a company called Zapier. They're like if this then that. If you're familiar with them, same kind of company, and they're a company that lives on APIs. That's all they connect to one service layer and then make an automated connection between. Let's say Twitter and Facebook. Anytime something happens on Twitter, I want you to do this thing on Facebook, and they make these connections, all API driven.
Well, and that's the thing. It's the first thing I do when I'm on make a new account to something, or I scroll to the bottom to see if they have that little developers link. Click that developers link, and it's api.whatever.com. Like, perfect. Yes, there's API, so I can do what I want to do with this site versus use just what they have. And I think that is the power with anything, is being able to provide your data or your services in a lot of different mediums without having to re-architect the whole thing.
Yeah, or direct access to the data.
Which, if you have to re-architect the whole thing, in that case, you probably built it wrong to begin with, and it should be re-architected.
Right. Hey, anything, as we kind of come in for a landing here, anything, let me ask you a forward-facing future question. What are you excited about when you think about the next couple years? What are you seeing in technology? Not even necessarily related to what we're talking about here, but what are you excited about when it comes to technology?
I think the web is the most exciting thing in the way that, because every day it's evolving in the way that we're able to work with services and consume our content wherever we want to consume. I think it's going to be interesting with the plethora of devices that are coming out. Now with Apple's rumored devices, which they are announcing shortly, but we still don't officially know what they are.
Very soon, right? In a couple days.
I think it's a couple days from now. So they used to always be really hard-nosed in their screen resolutions and what they're providing, and now there's going to be bigger phones and potentially bigger iPads, and we're becoming into a world where devices really don't matter. It doesn't matter what you're on, and it's kind of fun to see the development processes around that change to accommodate that, and to us stop having that discussion of like, okay, well, we need an app or we need a site. Well, let's build it so it works on the iPhone first, and then we'll move on. Well, Android is, I think iOS is 35% of the market, Android is 50% of the market, and so Android's the more popular platform.
But people buy on iPhones.
Exactly. The stat about zero apps a month being downloaded, it doesn't matter.
But nobody's downloading your apps.
Nobody's buying, except for those individual productivity. I mean, everything's software as a service nowadays anyway, right? $10 a month gets you this,
Yes.
But I think the exciting thing is how we're seeing traditional web presence merging with mobile development that really took off in the late 2000 or like 2009 2010 eras, and now we're kind of back to this agnostic little world of just build your content, get it up online, make it work right, and there isn't really right or wrong answers right now, but it's all about people coming up with the most creative solutions.
Yeah. Is the tablet going to make it in your mind? Is it going to be an intermediate device? Because it seems like a big rush to tablets, and now we're since phones have gotten so big.
Well, I'm biased because I'm a developer.
Yeah.
You know, I'm just not a home user,
Right.
non-technical sort of. But my iPad, I watch videos on it. That's about it. You know, maybe catch up on Twitter while I'm laying in bed. You know, because it's a bigger screen than my phone.
Yeah.
But I didn't even bring my iPad on this trip because, you know, I've got my laptop, I've got my phone, and you know, tablets. You know, at least certain tablets just aren't productive enough for me. They're not that much more productive than my phone.
Right.
And their limitation between that and my laptop, it's so much easier for me to pop open my laptop and actually respond to what I need to respond to, or, you know, until I can actually develop really seamlessly on a tablet. For me, they're just kind of a toy. You know, in what it is. And I mean, they have great applications in, you know, sales, you know, people walking around a big box store with a tablet helping customers, like, you know, those kinds of things where that becomes a really lightweight tool, point and shoot, you know, checking in for different things, you know, there's obviously business use cases where they make sense.
But you're not going to go out in the evening and carry your tablet.
No,
you know, you're not going to.
Not at all.
It's just interesting that had its day and now it's fading a little bit. We may see some new things come out that revive tablets.
And it's always kind of exciting to see what, you know, because Apple for a long time has always been kind of pushing the envelope, you know, for better or worse in some cases, in how we want and what we want, or knowing what we want before we want it, and so, you know, watching them to see if they're starting to recognize any shift in that. And you know, now it's kind of, we've moved to that wearable realm where, like, you know, it's all about smart watches and this kind of thing. And I, you know, until they start making wearables not look like you're in Star Trek or something, you know, I'm kind of really not too into them. Like,
it's still
Google,
nichey. Yeah,
the Google Glass thing. You know, every time I see one, I'm just kind of like, you know, maybe someday I'll get used to it. I suppose it's the way that people thought about, like, clothing, you know, and that kind of.
No, I don't think it is. I think like, glass is interesting.
Like, people wearing that? Oh, well, I guess that's cool, you know. So maybe it'll take on, but, you know, there's, you know, I really think, like, wearables should be, you know, not used, not noticed. Like, they should be seamless.
Well, that's the problem with Bluetooth headsets, and you know, you're like, you don't want to see them, you don't want to, right? I mean, the geeks, it's a geek thing, right? So, you know what I find interesting? You were talking about both with Apple and with Microsoft. Both have CEOs or had CEOs that were very restrictive, and they both moved to two new CEOs, both Tim Cook and Satya Nadella.
Changed things very
that all of a sudden it's like we need to be everywhere. Android maybe being the opposite, where they're actually probably employing more standards than they ever have.
Well, and really, I think it's a product of at least in the Apple Android sort of realm of their history, where Android traditionally has been extremely fragmented. You know, there's lots of different operating systems in the wild, lots of different devices in the wild, whereas Apple traditionally was, you want to buy a laptop, you get two choices. You want to buy a desktop, you get one choice. You know? You want to buy a phone, we got one. You know, like it was a very tight ecosystem, and now that Apple has held on to that for a while and is branching out, Android at the same time has done a really great job of standardizing their platform and reeling in that fragmentation, making the latest version of Android, you know, the majority of the phones running that version. So it's really changed the way that, I think that's helped Android become as popular as it is now. I mean, it's funny to think, you know, that, I mean, even though the iPhone still technically is the most popular individual device, the Android platform is blowing iOS out of the water.
Just in sheer numbers.
Yeah, just in numbers.
And who would have thought Samsung would have been as big of a player and as big of an influencer?
Fantastic job putting out. Well, they put out products that, you know, solve problems and you know, have really they have not just copied, but have, you know, bridged that gap.
Yeah, they scratched the itch. Is what they did. Well, Dustin, thanks for taking a few minutes. It's always good to catch up with you. And, of course, all of Dustin's information will be available right below the video window here in the meta. Down below on YouTube, we'll include, I'll get back with you and get whatever that information you want it to be. And you can contact him down below. Dustin, thanks again. Appreciate you watching.
Thank you very much.